And we're back on the 0 Hour. I am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Before we begin, just a thought. Rudyard Kipling, the writer, who knew a little bit about empire because he had served the British Empire at one point in his career, and some would argue propagandized it through much of his career. I did say something striking once. He said, a people in decline begins to resemble its shadow. A people in decline begins to resemble its shadow, which is a quote that's occurred to me at various times in the last 10 years, most recently during the January 6th uprising. We are a nation that has imposed regime change and war on many other nations around the world. Now we are seeing levels of instability that some of us did not expect to see in our lifetimes, others of us did. And here to explore all those issues with me for the first time this year, a guest I always look forward to speaking with, Danny Sjursen, that's Sjursen, is a writer. He is the co-host of the Fortress on a Hill podcast. He is a retired U.S. Army major, former instructor at West Point. I think I've got most of the details right, but without any further ado, Danny, welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's such a important time to talk about so many things.
Absolutely. And did I leave out anything critical about your bio before we go on?
No, I think that covers it. It can get complicated.
Yes, I know. We all have Kierkegaard said life can only be understood backwards, but it has to be lived forwards. And we're in that forward part of our lives right now. But you're also the author of 2 books, and I don't want to skip over that either. So, Danny, a couple of reasons I wanted to have you back on. You wrote a recent piece on the future of war and the American empire, whatever you want to call it, our network of military interventions around the country as we enter the Biden era. But even superseding that, perhaps, since I read your article, one of the things I really wanted to talk to you about, because you were involved with counterinsurgency, you were in the Middle Eastern wars as they engaged in counterinsurgency. One of the things I've been hearing since the Capitol Hill uprising on January 6th is I'm hearing a lot of people on television telling me that what we really need to do, among other things, suspend a lot of our remaining civil liberties, tattered as they are. And the second is that I'm hearing more and more of is to employ counterinsurgency techniques of the kinds we use in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, you would know more directly than I do, but it seems to me that's not drawing on a toolkit of successful strategies. And I'm wondering if you agree with my conclusion there.
Well, absolutely. One can hold 2 ideas, right? Sometimes even 2 opposing ideas in their head at the same time. In fact, Fitzgerald, said that's like the mark of a strong mind. We can both totally reject, find dangerous, and think that there have to be legal ramifications and accountability for the riot at the Capitol and all the things that are associated with that, and the rising tide of white nationalism and paramilitarism. We can reject all of that, but then equally be cautious and come out and reject the idea that we should use terms like counterinsurgency or wars at home, even on the most grotesque elements within our country. Usually the war analogy is not a positive one. None of our wars at home have really succeeded, have they? Wars on poverty, I wish that one had. War on drugs, that ended up just filling the prisons, right? With mostly Black and brown bodies in America. The problem with terms like that is that language matters. Language matters. And when in The Wire, the great, television series about Baltimore, there's a part where one of the police majors says, hey, the problem with this drug thing is that when you call something a war, then everyone's, all the cops start running around and acting like warriors. And next thing you know, the population that you're supposed to be serving, well, that just becomes occupied territory. And I think that, first of all, counterinsurgency is snake oil that has not worked for us, maybe ever, in any real sense. So that's one problem with applying it back home. And then the other one is that, I think we have to be very careful about the loss of civil liberties and the militarization of an already militarized society boomeranging back home. There will be second and third order effects to this. And make no mistake, historically, conceptually, and philosophically, when you curtail civil liberties against a group that maybe even is really distasteful, it will be used against other dissenting groups in the future. It actually ends up coming back on you. It has always been thus, and I would expect the same. We should be very cautious about using that terminology.
And, it strikes me that this is not a new phenomenon, even in, I guess, for what a lack of a better term, I would call American liberal culture. I'm thinking, for example, I wrote a 2-part essay in, I think it was 2014, maybe. 60 Minutes did a segment called Counterinsurgency Cops. I don't know if you were overseas then or if you remember it, but where Leslie Stahl, who turns out to have been on the board of some of the groups she's extolled, but Leslie Stahl was waxing poetic about these guys who said they'd come back from Iraq. I think it was Iraq or Afghanistan. I'm pretty sure it was Iraq, and became police officers and said, we're going to use the techniques we learned over there, which is, so disturbing to me, because the extension of that logic, number one, is that you, the police, you, the government, in this case, US government, are an occupying force. And the citizens of your country are a rebellious population that must be subjugated. And yet, what I would call the liberal, cocktail party, very decent establishment keeps embracing this social. That's right. We have to look at this as a counterinsurgency. And I guess there's so many dimensions where this can go, including the threat to civil liberties you mentioned and so on. But one of the things that bothers me about it is it seems an extension of this sort of fetishization that while, and I'm sorry, it seems like I'm hammering Democrats in particular, which I guess I am at this point, that obviously I deplore what these people, these rioters and their sympathizers were doing. But what you have just is a sort of polite version to me of a totalitarian impulse. And maybe I'm being too harsh on people, but I think as soon as you say we need to crack down, and I can't tell you how many people I come in touch with on social media who I think are good liberals, good, decent people, but I say to them, even people with extreme right-wing ideas have a right to express them. No, crush them. And it seems to me, I'm wondering, first of all, is this at all resonant to you of what you experienced overseas? And secondly, do you have any other thoughts about it?
Well, absolutely. I think a lot of this centers around a misunderstanding that liberals, right, the broad, vague category of liberals have always been peaceniks, or have always been averse to the use of military force at home or abroad. Now, the right has used that so effectively to paint themselves as patriots and the liberals as somehow weak, soft, almost emasculine, right? That I think people have begun to believe that myth. Of course, the reality is that liberals have always, or a certain class of liberal, has always been amenable to this idea of a good war, right? A good war abroad or a good war at home. And so this sort of short-sighted, polite liberal class that you mentioned, that I talk about a lot, have always been, positive towards this urbane, faux intellectual military type that has been peddling coin or counterinsurgency. In fact, they call the acolytes of it within the military the Coindinistas, right? A play on the Sandinistas. People like McChrystal, people like General Petraeus, they were heroes, because what they said is that in Iraq and in Afghanistan, we can fight a more genteel war, a social scientific war. But of course, the reality we found, and scholars have come around to this already, is that counterinsurgency was always a bloody, messy, dirty business, and it rarely works. And that when it is applied at home, it's often a disaster. The last thing that I'll say about this is you started off with Rudyard Kipling and Empire. And something that I've said many times, that I don't know if I've kind of stolen it from someone, but I use it a lot, is that empires in decline behave badly, period. And, dirty wars that are usually fought in that late stage of imperialism they usually come home. And in places in the 1960s and 70s, we saw that in France and Portugal, for example, there were coup attempts or successful coups of those military men coming back from Algeria and Angola, where they were fighting their dirty wars. The British didn't go that far, but they did put a whole bunch of people in concentration camps in Kenya. These dirty wars get ugly. They come home. And I think we have to be very, very careful about the good war myth and the idea that we can do it politely this time, humanely, tech savvy, and that it won't be bloody, it won't be a mess. In reality, I think that what we'll see is we will come to regret applying counterinsurgency language and tactics at home.
And again, we're talking with Danny Sjursen, author, a retired U.S. Army major, and columnist and essayist. That's interesting, Danny, for so many reasons, including that you've bridged the gap between the Future of War essay that I originally invited you on to talk about, and this issue of counterinsurgency techniques at home. And I would love to remind, I know you know this, you're a historian, a military historian, among other things, but I would like to remind our listeners that our failed legacy of counterinsurgency did not begin in Iraq or Afghanistan, even though we've been in Afghanistan 22 years. Vietnam War was considered a war of counterinsurgency. We did horrific things in the name of Operation Phoenix or whatever else we did in Vietnam, but before us, the French. And so this entire notion that somehow we can apply this at home, it also flies in the face, and I'd love your thoughts on this, Danny, because you served in the military. We've got, in my view, a sub-element, some former military and some not, but in the police forces and National Guards and sheriff's departments of this country, I think we have a subset of people who are, in effect, how should I put it, a potential paramilitary force. And what we saw during the Black Lives Matter protests, everybody blamed it on Trump, and Trump set a horrible environment. But I just wonder when the next, you mentioned that, people are applauding the idea of counterinsurgency to go after those they deplore on the right, and rightfully so. But I'm just wondering what happens when weather comes, the pandemic eases up, people come out for BLM again or another left-wing cause, whether we're not going to see the same sort of episodes of violence against peaceful demonstrators that we saw last year.
Look, I think that one of the things you're bringing up here is that this isn't new, and we can't put the start date of the disease at 9/11. And I do think that the historical record matters here, and not just in some geeky, like esoteric way. Coin wars, right? These counterinsurgencies abroad, these dirty wars, these, putting down rebellions, they tend to engender sort of like soul-searching fights for the soul of the nation at home. And they don't usually end well. They're not usually happy stories. Let's think about the Philippine-American War, right? The longest war in American history until Afghanistan, that U.S. troops were actively engaged in combat, right? So we're talking 1898 to 1913. Okay, this goes on so long that George Marshall, who leads World War II, is a lieutenant in the Philippines fighting in the Southern Islands. What we found there is that we take our original sin sort of baggage over there, meaning that in the Philippines, what did the soldiers largely call the Filipino insurgents who they invented waterboarding on, at least the American variety? Well, they called them the N-word, or they called them, savage Indians, right? Because some of those soldiers had fought in the Indian Wars. So we take our baggage over there, but then when they boomerang back home and they become strike-breaking police, remember, that's what many of those soldiers ended up doing, they take their counterinsurgency experience there, and they bring that home. So the whole thing is this like brutal cycle. And I think we just need to keep in mind that there are dangerous elements in this class, this supposedly genteel and urbane class of military veterans who are saying we should use coin. Stanley McChrystal, who led the surge in Afghanistan, now runs a consulting organization called the McChrystal Group. It is full of generals and colonels who were in these wars. If you read the mission statement of the McChrystal Group, what they say is we want to advise businesses and municipalities on how to apply this coin-like leadership and experience we had to problems in America, up to and including fighting COVID which they've had like massive failures doing and basically just jilted cities out of money. The point there is these are dangerous people, but they are wearing sort of like sheep's scholastic clothing. But be wary of those folks. I mean, it's a Trojan horse. It really is.
And Danny Sjursen, I think what you've done there is, and importantly, is pivot from, I brought up the people in our police forces and elsewhere who, maybe are sort of treating their fellow Americans, bringing back the psychology of an occupying force to our own country. And let's not forget that our country from the beginning was an occupation nation because it was already populated by Native Americans when we got here. But and not to mention slavery in the captive population, which was the other original sin of this country. But you pivoted, and I think importantly so, to, I would say, perhaps the far more dangerous animal in this jungle of war and peace, which is the polite society version. And, it seems to me, and I was a consultant for the State Department in the late 80s, early 90s, and so on. I didn't last. It seems to me people who see the moral horror of some of the things we do overseas are almost automatically, whether by their own reaction or by exclusion for the things they say and do, are automatically excluded from the power structure. So while a lot of people are saying, well, we'll get a more humane foreign policy now that Joe Biden's in, by dint of maybe I'm being too cynical, but to me, by dint of the fact that they've survived as foreign policy professionals and as military policy professionals, that with very few exceptions, that very success in that world excludes them from being people who will think humanely or rationally, or at least publicly so, about what we're dealing with. Am I being overly cynical here?
No, I mean, I don't think so at all. I mean, look at the people that have been appointed to Biden's foreign policy advisory team, right? His national security team. I would argue, I think we would agree that abroad and with a lot of boomerang effects at home, America is in a 5-alarm foreign policy crisis right now. But if you look at the people that have been brought back in to ostensibly solve that, it's the arsonists put in charge of the fire brigade. And so you have the people who did Libya, who did Yemen, right? And unapologetically so in many cases. Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, being the worst example. And they're in this spot. What worries me about them is that I don't want Trump back. I mean, God, no. I mean, the worst, right? Just can't stand it. But I want to be honest about the limitations of making him the only problem. Because what concerns me is this. I prefer my monsters out in the open rather than hiding under my bed. And I'm still a little scared of the dark. And I think that sometimes these folks who present as polite, genteel, fairly intelligent, they scare me because they are able to sell us, forever war and this sort of hyper militarized policing. But hey, this time it's a good one because it's against really bad guys. And I wonder what Clarence Darrow would say. The lawyer from like the 1920s who would defend the Klan and anarchist bombers at the same time, and is kind of one of the, the originators of like the ACLU and this idea that we have to defend civil liberties everywhere. I don't hear a lot of voices like that anymore because we're in our tribal battle stations, which is where we run to every time there's a crisis, and I think that's dangerous and short-sighted.
You have a lot of reactions to that, Danny Sjursen, and one of them, and by the way, I just have to get this out before I get to that, is the left is consistently naive. Whenever there's a crackdown on the civil liberties of the right, it's about 3 minutes before they start cracking down on the left. And we've even seen that with the Russia story very early on. Counterpunch and some other publications I write for, I imagine some of you write for, were immediately deprecated, as they say on Wikipedia, and downgraded in searches and God knows what else. But and maybe we can get back to that. But I guess I was going to put this to you. Maybe I'm sort of making you my therapist here for a second, Danny. But I sort of operate. I'm sort of three things. I think I'm a journalist. I try to get the facts right. I'm an essayist. As an essayist, I try to think of what can be, not hobbled by the constraints of current politics or power relationships. And so that's a radical vision. And then to a certain extent, I'm an activist and like to see, changes in conditions in the present moment while we're working for that better world. Now, long-winded introduction, but it's a way of saying, I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out the right balance between pointing out that all these people, or a lot of these people, are embedded in an establishment that is deeply corrupted and misguided in its vision. And this part of me that still thinks, yeah, but maybe if I don't beat them up too badly in print, with the exception of Victoria Nuland and a couple others, which I just can't resist, but if I'm not too rough on them, maybe we can persuade them, to go a little further in nuclear disarmament negotiations with Russia and other countries. Maybe we could convince them to ease back. Do you get what I'm talking? It's this sort of internal struggle I deal with, because I have a lot of friends who just let it rip, and maybe I should just let it rip. But there's this part of me that says, well, maybe they can be negotiated with. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. I mean, this is something that I really struggle with. When it comes to Biden's foreign policy picks, I think I've developed a bit of a reputation and a lane of being one of those people who's kind of all in to call out what I see as indecency. That all being said, I think it would be a misunderstanding to think that that I'm a hater, right? That I'm just going to crush everybody. I do think that there is nuance and gradation. I think we have to be careful about who we can negotiate with, who can be influenced from the grassroots and who can't. But I also think we need to be realistic about it. And so I think it depends on the sort of work you're doing in terms of activism or sort of, public writing. I mean, it depends on your lane, right? I mean, each according to his sort of ability to some extent there. And in general, though, I think that especially now, I thought it was important to critique this stuff coming in from the Democratic Party before they even came in, or when Trump was still president. But especially now, I think it's got to be no holds barred to a certain extent. But that we have to be careful about, though, I think, is not a complete alienation or the perception that means you're actually enabling this like far right. Because let's be clear, the Republican Party is off the rails. I mean, it is off the rails. I mean, it bears no resemblance to a mainstream centrist party anymore. So, I mean, we don't want to be perceived as doing that. But in general, I think depending on your position, it's right to sort of, call out indecency where you see it. And I think that when I look to my dead soulmates, and most of mine are dead, right? When I think to Eugene Debs, when I think to people like Clarence Darrow, when I think to Smedley Butler, right? These anti-war activists of various types, I really do try to think, like, how would they handle this? Like, would they let the Obama and Biden people, off the hook for Yemen, off the hook for the Espionage Act and Chelsea Manning? And I have to believe they would not. And so I also have to believe that they would call out the problematic nature of this team. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do our best to try to, influence from the grassroots, because real change ever, thus, and always has come from there, not from great white men or anybody else.
Absolutely. And, I find, I don't know, I can't speak for Smedley Butler or any of the others, and I'm just, a little guy, but I find that I promise myself I'm going to hold my fire long enough to see if I can establish, rapport or whatever. I can't it's not like somebody said to me, like in 2010, you picked a lonely road. You're fighting the Democratic Party now, as well as the Republicans. It's like, I didn't pick it. I don't know about you, but I just was constitutionally incapable of not speaking out. And I'm not trying to aggrandize myself, because I could probably do a lot better. But, I just can't keep my mouth shut when I know, just on a personal level. What's that like for you?
I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, I've alienated a lot of, vaguely liberal friends. I mean, social media is a tough beast. But, I agree. I mean, it's hard to avoid like a self-righteous streak whenever you talk about this. I just know that when I wake in the middle of the night, which is pretty often, and always has been since I was a kid, I mean, there's a sense that if I'm soft pedaling something, and that I'm doing it for some tactical and personal reason, then like I feel a lot of guilt about it. And so while I am also very self-critical because I wonder sometimes if I'm going too far, it's hard to strike that balance. But I would generally like to tack in the direction of calling out that indecency where I see it. And again, this is very quick, but there is a historical backdrop to this. I mean, it is dangerous to give a pass to the more liberal party in the two-party system, because we have to remember it was the Democrats, it was the liberal hawks,
right,
who did the worst wartime crackdown at home in American history, which was World War I. They broke the back of socialism in America through the Committee for Public Information, through the mail war, not letting socialist stuff through the mail during World War I. They helped liberal magazines like the New Republic, even, I believe, or definitely the Washington Post, were like almost cheering on some of these like vague lynchings that were happening of German Americans and seditionists, or what they called seditionists. They fought for this like voluntary citizen, posses of like policing patriotism, and they put together the Sedition Act, which put Eugene Debs in prison for, a 10-year sentence. So, and even the early Red Scare was under Wilson and the Democrats, which J. Edgar Hoover was the young point man on. So the reason I bring that up is not just to give a history lesson, but to say there's a long backstory of, places like even The Nation, which, I've written for and I like, but in some of their past times, I've been kind of liberal hawks and apologists for this. And so the point is, we cannot give this stuff a pass, because we've paid for it before. We'll pay for it again. And World War I is not the most recent example, but it's just an important one.
No, and people forget or don't know that the World War I equivalent of Muslims, and the way we suppressed Muslims, was Germans, was German Americans, were Trump's people. They monitored, spied on German American churches. They shut down German language newspapers. They harassed and closed down German businesses by urging people to boycott them. So it's not as if any of this is new, or that it's never been directed against white people who think they're immune from all of this. They're also forgetting that people from Oklahoma were met by vigilante posses at the border, and sometimes with sheriff's posses as well at the border of California, told to go home, and terrorized, and so this is a long-standing streak. I guess I would maybe in the concluding portion of our conversation, Danny, say, well, okay, we've got a message we want to get to the public, and we have because the grassroots is where the change occurs. They'll get out, or they'll stop doing what they're doing when the public demands it. And the left, to me, quote unquote, has been a great disappointment to me. They've been so cowed by this peacenik propaganda that they become even more warlike. If we could break down that message so that people, ordinary, which is a deprecating term in a way, but people who are just busy with other things, if we could break down the vision of foreign policy and military policy we'd like to see in kind of couple minutes, or the principles behind it, would you feel up to doing that? And what would you think that sounds like?
Absolutely. That's the toughest question. I mean, those of us who are, are writers and speakers, we tend to be really good at pointing out problems and not so great at crafting solutions. Right. And I think we have to be honest about that. And that's a limitation for me. But what I've been thinking about recently is that the American people are paycheck to paycheck, and they're busy, and they're living amidst pandemic, and they're struggling. And time is always of the essence. And so the focus is very rarely on foreign policy. And so what needs to be demonstrated is that war is, and always has been, a kitchen table issue, because empire comes home, because dirty wars come home. And that if the pandemic and the crackdown, the militarized crackdown on Black Lives Matter in the streets wasn't exposure enough that empire comes home, then I don't know what was. And so, I grew up in an era when the Army's slogan in the recruiting commercials was "Be all you can be." Great commercials, very effective, paid for by corporate, advertisers or contracted out to them. Well, I think the Pentagon needs a new cheeky sort of onion style motto, which would be the Department of Defense. This is why you can't have nice things. Mm-hmm. Because what we want to show the people is that this excessive spending and focus on overseas wars takes from them in the trade-offs and opportunity costs for a more decent society at home. And so to me, the pandemic and the lack of money to like CDC and things like that, and then the militarized policing crackdown on mostly peaceful protests for Black Lives Matter should have been the exposure we need. And I would beat that drum, that this is a kitchen table issue, and it matters even if you live 200 miles from and don't have a single family member in the all-volunteer military.
I think that's a fantastic point. And before we go, I can't resist pointing out, you mentioned the military's old motto. I come from an old military family where military family on my mother's side, where, most of the men, my grandfather was a colonel and so on, but, left with some cynicism and internal and external wounds. But at least they believed in a military that was based on collaboration. And at least they came away, however negative they felt about the wars they fought in, with a sense that it was a way of bringing people together, teaching them collaboration. And that was a long way from my grandfather who fought in World War I, or my great-grandfather who fought in the Civil War, to when the Army's motto was Army of One. Army of One. If that doesn't talk about the individualistic, nihilistic elite culture of the time, just be alone with be an Ubermensch with nobody to report on. Before I let you go, do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mean, I do think that's important. Look, the all-volunteer military has always largely been a veneer or sort of a mirage. And one of the things we found out is that nobody really believes. None of the soldiers I know, none of them, officers, enlisted, believe that these wars can be won. And they haven't thought it was even a possibility. They would laugh at you if you brought it up for 15 years, in my experience. And so what we found is that when we talk about recruiting and why serve, there's a lot of patriotism, bluster. But in the end, it's what can I get out of it? Let's give you a trade. Let's give you a bonus. This becomes like a bribery until what we create is a professional Praetorian guard of soldiers overseas. An Army of One is almost the perfect motto for the times. And we've given up the responsibility of the citizenry to both serve in and oversee those wars. And that is a cultural disease that worries me.
Beautifully said. And we'll have to leave it there. But Danny Sjursen, where should people go to learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Real simple, skepticalvet.com, my website, got all my writing, and then follow me on Twitter @skepticalvet. I'm plugging stuff out all the time, probably too much. And thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. You are plugging stuff out. I admire you for that. Always a pleasure. Always appreciate your insights. Danny Sjursen, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks. Always a pleasure.
And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The 0 Hour.